Characters are ultimately defined by their actions, by their choices. Who they are is not this severed little atomized cell that's completely apart from their worlds. They are inevitably shaped by their worlds, and they are inevitably bound to reveal themselves to others and to themselves through the actions that they take. You could say that this is true for everyone, that the idea of this self as this abstract entity apart from how we actually behave and what we actually do and the choices we actually make and what we actually say in the public sphere in our relations with others and our environment is empty and hollow. We're inevitably connected to that environment. Someone like Hannah Arendt talks quite brilliantly about how social spaces, communities, are how we reveal ourselves, how we ultimately craft our identities. It's not that our environments determine who we are for us, that would be mechanistic and fatalistic, but it is that when we think of ourselves, what we think of cannot and is not this abstract, isolated little apart entity, but rather a fundamental relation between the self and the world. The self is inevitably connected to the world, and thus actions, not necessarily grandiose big actions, but everyday interpretations of ourselves in relation to others, in relation to the places we live, in relations to the jobs we work, and the people we care for, and the shops we frequent. That is who we are. The self is not set, but is rather inevitably coming into being and inevitably being formed. In any case, this is certainly the case with characters in stories. You don't have to agree with this interpretation of the self as a philosophical truth, but as a method of storytelling, it is quite good and quite thoughtful. Callum is in this strange situation where he needs to decide who he is, and he needs to decide what he wants for himself. Callum is ultimately a more abstract and foggy character than a lot of others in The Dragon Prince at this point, precisely because we do not know him as perhaps we ought to. We do not know as much about him as we really should. This is not because we have not spent a lot of time with Callum. We have. But ultimately, he is someone who has a lot of doubts and anxieties and a lot of conflicted feelings. As do most people. We don't all feel in one way. There are inevitably contradictions and complications, but how we resolve those through our actions, through our behavior and speech and communication with others in the world ultimately is what solidifies our basic senses of self. And Callum doesn't really have a clear set of instances where he makes these big decisive choices in the same way that other characters do. Soren may not be as complicated or as elegantly crafted a character as Zuko, he might not have this very serpentine and very sinuous character journey where every choice inevitably leads to these repercussions that heighten the contradictions between who he believes he is and how he interacts with the world. But Soren has choices where the decision that he makes ultimately defines him. We know that he has these conflicted feelings, but we also know that he decides to act on them by leaving behind his father, leaving behind Claudia when he believes she is too lost and too zealous to be convinced or reasoned with. And he joins the side of the good and the just, and he fights on that side no matter what. We also have a very clear idea of who someone like Viren is. Viren is probably the most compelling and agonizing character in the show, precisely because he does have all of these abstractions about who he is. He does have all of these presumptions about himself and the world, and these conventions, these habits of behavior that he has convinced himself are correct, and that are genuinely motivated by real idealism and real passion, and yet ultimately his experience in the world reveals the extent to which those ideals are insufficient, and that his convictions about the world and the habits that stem from those convictions are ultimately deleterious to the well-being of himself and others. But Callum is less of a certain entity here. We know that he doesn't want to use dark magic. Okay. And he has not used it. Okay. But that says more about what he is not, what he does not want for himself, who he does not want to be. It says significantly less about who he is. It says less about the basic essence, the basic core of his being. Callum ultimately is the opposite of Rayla in the relationship between his emotions and his actions. Let me explain. Rayla is both consistent and inconsistent in different and frustrating but ultimately predictable ways. She is consistent about how she feels. If Rayla had been driven by her emotions, if she had ultimately surrendered herself to her most basic moral impulses about what she thinks is right, she would not be in as precarious situations as she has found herself in. She feels this deep sense of wrong, this deep sense of injustice, this deep sense of uncertainty when she is going along with the missions for the elves, and she feels it again when she leaves Callum. And thus damages the basic foundation and fabric of their relationship. In both of these instances, Rayla ascertains her own feelings, but she struggles to discern how she should square these feelings with her own beliefs about herself, with the convictions that she had held, and also with the actions one takes as a result of their convictions. Rayla has a strong sense of love for Callum, love for justice and virtue, and a deep hatred of hurting anyone. And yet she does not always behave in perhaps the most beneficial and helpful manner in response to those feelings. She fundamentally pulls back from leaving the elves or challenging their convictions for too long because she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know how to behave. The elves, for all their faults, were her family, and she deeply treasures them. She deeply treasures her parents and their moral code, and Renan and his moral code, and she does not know what she would do or who she would be if she simply left them and simply abandoned that basic moral code, that specific ethos, that specific ideology. She's fundamentally lost, and she behaves in quite a contradictory and oftentimes aggravating fashion. She has this deep sense of honor that she wants to follow, even if following that honor conflicts with how she feels, conflicts with these basic impulses of what she believes to be right. This interferes with her in the early part of the show when she is deciding whether she can really leave the elves, and it interferes with her later when she leaves Callum. She fundamentally knows that she is hurting Callum, but she subsumes that knowledge under this grandiose conviction that what she is doing in leaving him and going off to find Viren is honorable and noble and better for all. It is not, but Rayla allows herself to become so driven by those convictions, so overwhelmed by this abstract idealism, that her basic empirical interactions with her environment go ignored. They become subservient to this zealous, overheated belief in these grandiose ideas of the just. Callum is a little different. Callum ultimately acts consistently in that he does not want to side with Erebos. He does not want to side with Viren. He has not made a lot of deeply regrettable decisions. The worst decisions that Callum makes are when he doesn't decide at all because he doesn't know how to feel. His feelings are scrambled in a way that Rayla's are not. I believe the odds of him making a choice on the level of deciding to betray his entire cause, betray Rayla in order to serve Erebos, because Erebos tempted him, I think the odds of that are ultimately low. That is not of a piece with everything we have seen in terms of how Callum tends to respond to difficult and fundamentally murky situations. What we see instead is that he doesn't act. He removes himself from the position of having to make difficult choices. Note that even when Rayla disappears, he doesn't try to go off and find her. Obviously, he wants to know if there's any word of her, but he could have just tried to spend months and months and months just searching for her, looking for her, but he doesn't. He doesn't know what to do, so he does nothing. His feelings are ultimately the problem here, in that they are too inconstant and too ambiguous. He does not really know how to feel about what he is encountering, about a world that overwhelms and overflows his preconceived expectations. That is fundamentally more complicated and more tenuous and more enigmatic than the beliefs he held as a child would have had him believe. When Callum knows how he feels, he does not have a difficult job in acting based on those feelings. We see this in love. He is able to declare his feelings for Rayla. Awkwardly, but not really with shame. A bit of adolescent embarrassment, but he gets over that. When he believes that a certain quest or a certain mission is necessary, it usually is. His actions that follow from his certain feelings usually lead to beneficial results in a way that Rayla's do not, because Rayla always has difficulty deciding on what the right choice of action is in relation to those feelings. But Callum ultimately needs to be able to act. He needs to be able to define himself as a character, as a hero, not by this Hamlet-like constantly questioning and doubting and being so skeptical and dour, but by placing himself in the world of action, in the world of behavior, in the world of experience, by defining himself by what he does instead of attempting to withdraw within himself and withdraw into this little crystalline pearl of perfection where he can't make any wrong choices, but that's only because he's not making any choices at all. But ultimately, that sense of self is hollow because it is not in the world. It is not based on actual behavior, on actual doing. And so his sense of himself and others' sense of him is necessarily partial and watery. He needs to be able to not just not be fully tempted by Erebos, but ultimately reject Erebos and ultimately chart a forward course for the world. For Callum, a character so often passive and indecisive, being able to act, being able to make a decisive choice, not just to not do bad things, but to advance a different vision instead, is ultimately the choice that Callum needs to be working toward over the course of the last few seasons of the show. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe down to my Patreon if you can, if you want to see more videos like this before anyone else can. Thank you all again. Keep walking the Dragon Prince. Adios, comrades.